Hi, I'm Alessandro Gangelosi and that's a new tip tutorial coming from cgcookie.com for Max Cookie. This time we'll see how to work with the motion blur inside Mentor Ray. So I just prepared a really simple scene. You see I have a skylight and a daylight system, and I have a box, and the box is animated. You see that we have the rotation over one axis. Um, if we'd like to have the motion blur using this scene, you see that if I try to render the scene, we have no motion blur. So we have to say to the mesh uh, using the object properties to use the object motion blur. That's the just this type we can use inside Mentor Ray. And if I try to render, you see that we have again no motion blur. So we have to go inside the renderer, and in the camera effects you see that we have a panel motion blur enable. And if I try to render, you see that we have the motion blur. Let's use a better anti-alias so we have the final quality. Let's render it again, and you see that's our test. Inside the motion blur, you see that we have two kind of selector. We have enable to enable the motion blur, and blur objects to say that we'd like to have blurring on all the objects. And that's why it can be useful in two ways. For example, I can have this object without motion blur selected set to on. If I try to render using just the motion blur set to yes, you see that we have motion blur on the first one and no motion blur on the second one. So we have to work for sure, for example, to set manually the use motion blur on the objects, or we can say blur all objects. So all moving objects inside our scene will be affected by motion blur, and you see that we have motion blur on both the two boxes. But the blur all objects can be useful also when you have the animated camera. So you have not to say to all the mesh that must be affected by motion blur in rendering, but you can say that the entire scene will be affected by motion blur just because you are using the animation on the camera. So that will be a way to use the motion blur selecting the single mesh or using the blur all on all the mesh. We have another possibility that is to use a faster motion blur. Actually, we are using the 3D motion blur, and we can go inside the rendering algorithm inside Skyline, and we can say use fast rasterizer, and you see rapid motion blur. And that's a way to calculate a motion blur, a faster motion blur. You see it's really fast to be calculated. It's not so precise, and we have the possibility to use more samples. You see very high level for sampling, for example 16, and the quality will be higher, so very similar to the 3D motion blur, and it will be faster to be calculated. We can go more in depth using, for example, 25, and the quality is very high and it's really fast to be calculated. The problem is that it's really good with bidimensional motion blur. For example, you see we have motion blur due to a rotation, so we are using two axes. But if you are trying to use the motion blur over three axis animation, it will be not so good. So it will be better to use the three-dimensional one, or it depends on the time you have to make the render, so you have to decide it. Let's remove it, and we just remove it, and we can remove the blur or objects, and we can work on the parameters just to understand how it works. And you see the animation is really simple. So let's move a little the camera, okay, and let's work on it. Okay. The first option we have is the shutter duration in frames, and it will simulate the shutter speed of the camera. So if we have, for example, 0, we'll have no motion blur. You see, If we have 0.5, it's the default, we have a basic motion blur amount. And if we use an higher value for the shutter duration, we'll have more motion blur because we have more duration for the shuttering of the camera. For example, let's try with 5. You see, we have a lot of duration for the motion blur of this mesh. We are capturing more position and we have better interpolation. Then we find the shutter offset, and that's the offset for the position of the blurring effects. If we use the minus 0.25, that's the default value, we'll have the motion blur a little bit before the actual frame, and we can move it, but it's better to use the default value to achieve a more realistic result. The motion segments is a quality parameter that will be useful to have a more realistic motion blur. You see that we have a rotation, but you can see a very straight line there. So using better and higher value for the motion segments can be useful to have a more realistic rotational movements, for example, in this example, or for example, when you have curve animation. So we can try to use, for example, 5. Obviously, using let's make a copy. Using an higher value will give you the possibility to have higher rendering time, but you see, let's wait for the last bucket. You see that that's not good, and that's perfect because we are making a complete rotation. So that's a really realistic rotation. Let's close it. Okay. And you see, for example, there we can use, for example, 10. It's a very high value, but you see that we have a really precise rotational motion blur. So that's a way to achieve a better quality, for example, for some kind of complex animation. The last parameter we have is the time samples. The time samples is useful for the shading of the material. By default, we have 5, and it means that every single material for every single mesh will be calculated 5 times during the shutter duration. So it will be useful to have a better quality for the changing material, for example, for animated materials or for complex material. And it will be really useful when we have reflection or refraction that will change really fast. For example, we have a reflective material applied to an animated mesh that will be moving really fast. So it's better to use an higher value for the time samples. If you have no shaders and no material, like in our example, you can use the base default value. So that's just an higher render time and no higher quality in this example. So it's useful to have it as default. So as you saw, it's really simple to use the motion blur. That's the possibility to use the 3-dimensional one and the b-dimensional really fast, and you can use it, and you have a complete control over the quality and the rendering time. So for this tip tutorial, it's all. I hope to see you again on Max Cookie to check for new tip tutorial coming from cgcookie.com. Bye.